Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nora Garcia Romero, and today I will be presenting an analysis of The Red Badge of Courage. First and foremost, the novel was written by Stephen Crane, and you may ask, who is Stephen Crane and why is he important? Let's jump right into that. Let's look into certain details of Crane's life. Starting off with the basics, he was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1871, was a youngest of 14 children, and actually grew up in a very religiously oriented household, but later rejected their moral beliefs. One fun fact is that his ancestors had served in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, therefore, he did develop an interest in the military. This prompted him to consider applying, as we can see here in the PowerPoint, to West Point, but later decided against it. So he instead took on the path of a writer. So let's look into some of his other literary works. In the very far left, we have Crane's first book he ever published, which was in 1893. It's called Maggie, a Girl of the Street, and it's basically a portrayal of the urban poor and its development of dialect. In the middle, we can see The Open Boat by Stephen Crane as well, published in 1898, and personally, it's one of my favorites. It's based off of Crane's actual experience, but he turns it into fiction. On January 2nd, he was a correspondent on the steamer Commodore, which sank. So we can see how Crane got his real life experience and turned it into fiction, and it's really interesting. I really do recommend that work of his. And lastly, on the right, we have War is Kind and Other Poems, which was a series that he published in 1899, 1 year before his death. So, going back to The Red Badge of Courage, this novel was what made him sort of a celebrity or well known amongst literary naturalists, which was a mode that Crane is known for during his time period. And he was prompted by articles in magazines he would see that emphasized battles and generals, but said little about the actual psychological drama of war. So let's get into the audiences that Crane was trying to address. So, who did Crane directly and indirectly address whilst writing the story? So, let's take a look into the intended or most prominent audience. This would have to be the upper class society living in the East Coast or the Northeast of the United States, and this is because of the historical context. Now, let's remember that the Homestead Act was passed in 1862. So, in 1895, when Crane published The Red Badge of Courage, only 23 years had passed. Despite the fact that this is a long time and that the West was developing, it still did not compare economically and socially to the status of the more industrialized cities in the Northeast. Furthermore, during the 1890s, the South was going through a serious depression. The sharecropping system had led both white and black farmers to pitiful poverty, and by 1894, the price of U.S. cotton plummeted to 4 cents in a pound, which definitely left farmers with great debt and economic insecurity. Therefore, because the upper class society had the leisure time, had the education, this would have to be considered Crane's most intended or most direct audience. Now that we have covered intended audiences, let's dive a bit deeper into the hidden audiences of The Red Badge of Courage. So, firstly, Crane could have been addressing other literary naturalists at the time. We have Ambrose Bierce, we have Hamlin Garland and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who were very well known writers and authors in the literary sphere. So, as we discussed earlier, The Red Badge of Courage really makes Crane a bit of a celebrity. So, this could have been Crane's way of establishing himself also as a author, as a writer, and in the literary atmosphere at the time. But most importantly, this novel also addresses people who are seeking a greater truth or revelation about the war. We mentioned earlier how Crane was prompted to write this novel because he read so many articles in magazines about battles and generals, but little about the actual soldiers. So this addresses that psychological drama, that complexity of war, and debunks the notion of it. So now that we have covered the hidden audiences as well, let's look into the purpose of the document, what it conveys, and how it is supported. The most obvious purpose of the document was to entertain the high-class society of the Northeast, and also to enlighten those who wanted to hear about the experiences of men in war through fiction. But there was a metaphorical and underlying purpose which leads us straight into the author's thesis, and it goes as follows. Like the Badge of Courage in Crane's story is an allusion to an imagined reality of war, so was fake prosperity in the political and economic climate in the 1890s. Now, before jumping into the historical context, let's take a look into the following. Evidence found within the novel itself to support our overreaching thesis, which is that the Red Badge of Courage is an illusion of an imagined reality of war, can be found on page 2, chapter 1, at the very beginning of the novel, where Henry is describing battles of war as them having glory in them. And as we can see here from the quote, it reads, "His busy mind had drawn for him large pictures extravagant in color, lurid with breathless deeds." Now, this is at the very beginning. Let's jump into the next slide, where Henry, on page 32, says the following, or the narrator says the following, but it's Henry Fleming's thoughts. At times he regarded the wounded soldiers in an envious way. He wished that he too had a wound, a red badge of courage. We can see here now that the reason why he's joining the military is not to fight this greater cause. It's not because of the greater sphere of things, but rather it serves as a way of self-fulfillment. There is no glory in these soldiers losing their eyes in battle, just like there wasn't any glory in the previous slide where the soldier was wounded. These are actual people, so we can see the ignorance of the character in the protagonist, Henry, and the way in which he describes war, and the way in which war is actually playing itself out by people being forever psychologically traumatized. Now, you may ask, what does the Civil War have to do with the 1890s? 30 years had passed. Well, the society in which Crane lived in, for him, was going through an illusion similar to that of the Red Badge of Courage. And this leads us to our next slide. Let's talk about an age of capitalist prosperity. During the 1890s and prior to this, we saw a shift from the small farm and artisan workshop to the more mature industrial society. This created what seemed to be an overall economic prosperity within the United States. We have figures such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller that gained massive amounts of wealth by monopolizing the steel and oil industry. Therefore, we have this notion of the gospel of wealth, as we may call it, this worship of money, which basically told people that if you worked hard enough, if you conformed and followed capitalist norms, then you would one day be important figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. If we skip over to the next slide, I grouped all these 5 pictures together just to show how interconnected they were during the time. So if you wanted to have this palatial home, then you would first have to work in this factory, as we see here in the middle. And this factory was owned by people like John D. Rockefeller, which we see on the bottom left. So we see how, although these are pictures right now on the PowerPoint, during the 1890s, this was the thought process. Factory, palatial homes, the worship of wealth, the worship of these figures. So it was this overall false notion which Crane hidden subconsciously addresses through the Red Badge of Courage. We see that this may have been the reality for some, but the reality for others was otherwise. And we'll see this in the next slide. The reality for the majority was downwards prosperity, Much of the working class remained desperately poor and to survive needed income from all family members. Because of this, although many jobs had poor labor conditions, the industrial workers still labored about 62 hours per week but did not have any pensions. They did not receive compensations for injuries, and they did not have protections against employment. We see this also growing line and growing division of classes. It becomes more visible during the 1890s. The poor keep getting poorer and the rich keep on getting richer, and the middle line kind of disappears. So we see how this gospel of wealth, of this, if you work hard enough, you'll get there, it was not serving the people. It was false because the important figures that we talked about were also robber barons. They monopolized the industry and did not allow competition to spur, and most importantly, did not allow others to grow. Therefore, there was no economic prosperity. There was just downwards prosperity. I ask, how does the historical context tie back to the novel itself? Well, before getting into that, let's take a look at this quote taken from page 2, chapter 1. She could calmly seat herself, and with no apparent difficulty, given many hundreds of reasons why he was of vastly more importance on the farm than on the field of battle. This is when Henry tells his mother that he has enlisted and he will go to the war. Now, the historical and the novel are tied because very apparently Henry Fleming is poor. He is not upper class, nor are the soldiers in the field based on their dialect, and his family, which seems to consist of only him and his mother, are already struggling as it is. Yet Henry is choosing to go to war over this notion, over this fake reality. So, based on the historical context, we've seen how great society could be in the 1890s, for some, but we also see the other side of the token. People in, as we see here in the pictures, people in horrible working conditions, children forced to work to sustain their families. Therefore, in many ways, The Red Badge of Courage is a social critique of the 1890s and the illusion it created for many. Just like there was no honor in the end, as we see through the development of Henry's character, there was no glory in working long hours and never seeing the true bread, aka the money. Now, this way, Stephen Crane is very much also critiquing people's aspirations during that time. Why should they aspire being captains of capitalism when they have very low chance of being there at the top as well? So this is how, in this aspect, Stephen Crane addresses the economic aspect through the use of the Red Badge of Courage. But as we follow, we also see another topic. The next topic is gender roles. Now, granted, it is very subtle within the novel itself, but nevertheless, it's worth noting. There are differences between how a man and how a woman is perceived and portrayed by Henry. On page 23, it says the following: he perceived that the man who had fought thus was magnificent. Now we see the protagonist really create this idealization of war and battle because it will grant him manhood, and because a man is fitted for the job, and because a man must go through these stages in order to become better, in order to really mature. On the other hand, on page 47 and 52, we see how women are portrayed. Right here we see on page 47, the cold cloth was like a tender woman's hand. And on page 52 we have the young lady and his mother as they drank his recitals, their vague feminine formula for beloved ones, etc., etc. So we do see this major difference between how a man needs to go through these processes to be to gain that manhood, and how women just are there as a shoulder to lean on, as tender, as feminine. And although, like I said, it is very subtle, there are differences in this. Now, let's jump into the historical context and why this is important to note for the Red Badge of Courage. The historical context tied back to the novel in regards to the gender roles is that during the 1890s, regardless of class, women were only able to find employment in areas suitable for the fairer sex. This meant domestic jobs, And in order to illustrate this, I included a quote from our Give Me Liberty book, which is a woman explaining how her job is. And she explains it or describes it as follows: It is a slave life, with long hours, late and early, 7 days in the week, bossed and ordered about as before the war. We see how women were really treated as second-class citizens, and even when employed, society expected them to leave the workforce if they were married or became pregnant. So really this overall dependency of men and not seen as what they could give back. Now, also during this time, we see a huge increase in the involvement of women's organizations in regards to politics in order to secure their place in the future in society. Therefore, that is why it's important to bring out the subtle hints of gender roles in the novel in order to really consider the overall historical context of it. Let's talk about the political climate of the 1890s. Now, the 1890s was a time of political reform. Not only did you have the farmers' revolt, but you also had the creation of the populist platform, who fought for the direct election of US senators and a few other objectives. In fact, in 1892, Ignatius Donnelly wrote the following about the United States. The United States is a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin by political corruption and economic inequality. Now, this goes back to what we were talking about before. Donnelly really had reasons to say this because many politicians and the government as a whole supported capitalists and the system that was established. This is seen through the little government regulation at the time. We have cases such as Lochner versus New York, which occurred in 1905. Although it being after the creation of the novel, it's still relevant. We see the favorment, if you will, of laissez-faire economics over regulation. Now, this ties back to the novel because on page 13, we see Henry have a switch in perspective in regards to the people in charge. Now, it says the following: He had been dragged by the merciless government, and now they were taking him out to be slaughtered. He goes on to say also that the generals were stupid and that the enemy would presently swallow the whole command. This could be tied back to the historical context because the captains in the novel are kind of the politicians in the government who are supposed to be protecting normal everyday people, but they're not doing so. They're letting people rot, they're letting people starve, they're letting children work. And we see this connection between the political climate and the social critique that we talked about earlier. Does the author present any information on how others reacted to these topics or events at the time? Not necessarily, but let's dive into that. Within the text itself, in chapter 9, we see a shift from the way Jim is described. Now, Jim is a friend of Henry's, and by this time in page 34 goes sort of crazy. He keeps on repeating this phrase, no, don't touch me, leave me be, leave me be. Now we see here how the war really tolls on people. He goes from being Jim to being a tattered soldier forever. So this is what we can find within the text itself, but it does not necessarily present any information on how others reacted. However, we do see a change in character for the main character, Henry. Now, let's get into that. So, what else is there, you may ask? Well, there's the development of Henry Fleming's character, which we see towards the end. I included here a quote from page 78, where it says here, "For a time, this pursuing recollection of the tattered man took all elation from the youth's vein. He saw his vivid error, and he was afraid that it would stand before him all his life." We see Henry reflect on the meaning of being a man, that in order to get this manhood, it was necessary for him to receive this red badge of courage. And he eventually did, but he realizes that it's not worth it, that his aspirations were built on false presumptions, and now the image of this tattered man, of Jim, will be with him all his life. So although the author does not directly state how others in real life reacted to the novel, we do see this shift in character that ties back to the reality of the 1890s and everything else we have talked about. Like the red badge of courage was an illusion, so were the aspirations of the capitalist society in the 1890s. As we have seen, the lower middle class worked long hours, and many wanted to be at the top with important figures such as Andrew Carnegie. From an outside perspective, looking into the lives of the 1% and the wealthy, capitalism and the overall political and economic climate did not seem bad. But as we have also seen, their power came from the suffering of others and was established through a caste system essentially that shunned people into political, economic, and most importantly, social cubes or atmospheres. As we discussed earlier in the slide about the author's life, Crane decided to not join the military. So this can be seen as a possible bias because throughout the novel itself, he does not offer a different perspective and really creates this whole argument against war and battle. Moreover, people can criticize the fact that he was not alive during the Civil War, therefore he shouldn't be writing about it. But besides this, the most important bias or the most prominent bias that can be reflected in the story, the novel, is that Crane was not upper class, nor did he enjoy the riches that capitalism brought to some. So he really builds this social critique of the 1890s slowly through his perspective. Moving on. What can we as Americans in 2020 learn from the author about life? In 2020, we as Americans can learn from the Red Badge of Courage two aspects. We can learn from the literary obvious and we can learn from the outside meaning. So let's get into the literary obvious. So the Red Badge of Courage is in many ways a coming-of-age story. We see the development on Henry's part from this idealization of manhood and war to the reality and the hideousness that it causes. We see the character realize that there's no humanity in turning into beasts of warfare, and we as human beings now can learn to critique, to judge, and to really evaluate our aspirations and our end goal. But now, moving on to the outside meaning. On the right-hand side, the first bullet point that I have is economic legacies. And I have this here because the legacies built during the era of Crane are still very much powerful in our society, money and political wise. The 1% still control more than middle and poor classes combined. And we also see the rise of, dare I say, modern robber barons such as Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg, who have constructed, in many senses, monopolies as well. Now, I included here the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, social media, and the political election for the following reasons. It really took a pandemic. It really took for us to be isolated in a way and have a bit more free time for us to see how economically and socially unequipped the country was to tackle such national crisis. Although we are secluded and although we are restricted now, we also see the rise in social media and more participation from younger crowds in regards to politics. For example, in TikTok, people were creating these groups, these pages in order to inform people, where they were providing links, they were encouraging others to vote. So just like Stephen Crane made that social critique of the 1890s, and his intention was for people to evaluate their aspirations, we are doing so right now during the pandemic. We are becoming more aware and working towards taking action in the social and economic and political crises that really do matter and when considering our future. This would conclude my presentation. Thank you.